Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Blumenthal, Booker, Cantwell, Carper, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Mikulski, Murray, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren. Aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Risch, Sessions, Thune, Vitter. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Scott, no.
No.
Mr. Rubio, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No.
Anyone wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 57, the nays are 41. The nomination is confirmed. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Brian Morris of Montana to be United States District Judge for the District of Montana, signed by 19 senators.
Pursuant to Rule 12, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
A quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Brian Morris of Montana to be United States District Judge for the District of Montana shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Yeah. Baucus. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, gotcha. Yes, sir, I did. Thank you. Your hands. I got you. Got you. Get your hands.
Come on, Rick, just once.
Miss Brown. Got it. Thanks. Wyden. Paul. Fish. Crapo. Got you, sir. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Thank you.
Sir?
Do you get some news to Becky's program?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you.
They'll be able to tell you. Settle down a bit.
Mr. Reno.
Oh, I see. Oh, and he's 10 minutes.
Casey.
He's 10 minutes late.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Oh, okay.
It's like, I got her.
I'll keep an eye out for him.
Yep.
Mr. Bozeman.
Oh, okay.
Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Yeah, you said no. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yes, the motion is about closure.
Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly. Gotcha. Gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, I got you, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar. I got you. Yes, sir. Ms. Landry, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Hardin, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Hatch, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Heller, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, McCain, McConnell, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, and Wicker. I did. Thank you. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Moran, no. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Seeing and hearing none, the motion is agreed to. 57 ayes, 40 nays. Pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 15 of the 113th Congress, there will be now up to 2 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination equally divided in the usual form. Majority Leader.
It's my understanding there's 2 hours equally divided. Is that right?
Leader is correct.
I yield back 59 minutes.
The time is yielded back. Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I have a unanimous consent request that has been cleared on both sides. This is to pass H.R. 3547 as amended, a bill to extend government liability subject to appropriation for certain third-party claims arising from commercial space launches. The bill supports the competitiveness of the United States space industry.
Senator from Florida.
A unanimous consent request.
Without objection. So ordered.
Okay, Mr. President, then I'll just say a couple of words about what we just passed.
You need to read this real fast.
Okay. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed immediately to the consideration of H.R. 3547, which is at the desk, as if in legislative session.
Clerk report.
H.R. 3547, an act to extend the application of certain space launch liability provisions through 2014.
Is there an objection to proceeding? Seeing and hearing none, Senator, proceed.
Mr. President, I ask further that the Nelson Amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to, the bill as amended be agreed to, the title amendment be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Okay. Mr. President, what we have just passed is the indemnification.
Senator's time has expired.
Well, thank you for the passing of the indemnification bill on commercial space launches.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I and my...
Will the Senator yield for a moment? The clerk will report the nomination.
The judiciary, Brian Morris of Montana to be United States District Judge.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I and my colleagues stand here today holding the floor in defense of fair and free debate and the long-standing traditions of the Senate that promote consensus. We're here today working on nominations because the Majority Leader has determined that that is the agenda for today. But there are important issues that we need to move to: the Defense Reauthorization Bill, the Water Resources Development Bill, the Farm Bill, the budget, and other vitally important legislation. We need to move to these bills, and we need to deal with them in a bipartisan way. And instead, we continue to work on nominees, and we're working on nominees really without the discussion and the debate and the consideration, and most importantly, without that bipartisan consensus, which has also always been a hallmark of the United States Senate. And because of the unilateral change in the long-standing rules of the Senate, that consensus is no longer required for advise and consent. A simple partisan majority will do. And so I've used time today to talk about the need for bipartisanship in nominations, but also bipartisanship in the important legislation that we need to address for the good of our country. Legislation like the right kind of health care reform. And I have provided real-life stories from the citizens of my state about the impact that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is having on them and their lives, and why we need to replace it with market-based reforms, a step-by-step, comprehensive approach that fosters choice and competition And we've put forward proposals to do just that. And I've also used time today to talk about other important issues that we need to advance on a bipartisan basis. For example, the Farm Bill. We need a 5-year Farm Bill. We're currently operating under an extension. That extension expires at the end of the year. We need to get a Farm Bill in place, and a Farm Bill is a great example of how we do things on a bipartisan basis, not only in the Senate, but also in the House. And so now I want to talk about another subject that's vitally important to our country, to our economy, to job creation, to national security, that also needs to be advanced and needs to be advanced in a bipartisan way, and that's energy. And I want to provide a specific example, and that's the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, I know you, Mr. President, as the presiding member of this chamber, want to see that project approved, and that's just the point. This is a project that will create jobs, create economic activity, that will create greater energy security. It's something that we can work on together with our closest friend and ally in the world, Canada, something that really goes to national security so that we're no longer dependent on the Middle East for oil, and it's something that is supported on a bipartisan basis and strong support from the American people. The polls show somewhere between 70 and 80% of the American public supports this project and wants to see it move forward. It's now been more than 5 years, since the permit applications were submitted to the State Department for the Keystone XL pipeline project. More than 5 years in the application process and still no decision. An exhaustive review process, including 5 environmental impact statements showing no significant impact to the environment. The most recently issued statement, draft statement, just last spring. The consent of every single state along the pipeline's route is in place. Every single state on the route supports and approves the project. The backing of a majority of Congress. Legislation to approve the project has passed in the House, and we've passed it right here in the Senate, only to have the President turn it aside. And as I said just a minute ago, the support of the American people, more than 70% in the most recent poll of the American people support moving forward with this project. Despite all of this, the Keystone XL pipeline project is still awaiting decision from the President of the United States. The long wait for approval is troubling enough, but it represents a larger issue for our nation and begs a bigger question for all of us who serve our states and the American people in this institution. How will America ever build an all-of-the-above energy policy if the President takes more than 5 years to approve just one piece of a comprehensive plan? I know that you've seen this issue before in your state when it comes to the Alaskan pipeline. How for years and years that was worked on until it was finally approved. Then once approved, not only was it a vitally important piece of infrastructure for the state of Alaska, but contrary to all the concerns that were raised in regard to the Alaskan pipeline, like the environmental concerns, it's proven to work and work very well. You address the concerns, the project was approved. The same is true for the Keystone XL pipeline. To recount briefly, this $7 billion, 1,700-mile high-tech pipeline will carry oil not only from Alberta, Canada, to refineries in Oklahoma and the Texas Gulf Coast, but it will also carry growing quantities of U.S. sweet crude from the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota, my state, and also Montana. Light, sweet Bakken crude. Highest quality oil produced. Even by modest estimates, it will create more than 40,000 jobs. Now, there have been a lot of estimates out there, some much higher. But the State Department itself, the administration's own State Department, has come out after, as I say, more than 5 years of study, and said that this project will create more than 40,000 jobs. At a time when employment still 7%, these are good jobs, jobs that put Americans back to work. So it will create more than 40,000 jobs, boost the American economy, and raise much-needed revenues for states and the federal government. And it's not raising revenues by raising taxes, it's raising revenues through economic growth. That's the way to do it. Not higher taxes, through economic growth. Further, and perhaps most importantly, it will help put our country within striking range of a long-sought goal, a vitally important goal for our country, true energy security. For the first time in generations, the United States, with its friend and ally Canada, will have the capacity to produce more energy than we use. Truly North American energy independence, eliminating our reliance on oil from the Middle East, Venezuela, and other volatile parts of the world. This is something Americans very much want. And so when you see in the polls they support this project by more than 70%, it's with a clear recognition that what are we doing getting oil from the Middle East when we should be getting it from ourselves right here in this country and from our closest friend and ally, Canada. And that we absolutely can do it, and that we can do it to an extent that is beyond our needs, and we can do it in short order, easily within the next 5 years if we approve projects like this one. Right now we produce about 60% of our fuel domestically. We still import 40%, much of it from the Middle East and other areas of the world that are hostile to our interests. The question is, why would we want to import oil from an unstable region of the world when we can import it, when we can work with our closest friend and ally, Canada, as well as move it from parts of our country that produce that oil, like my state and others, and transport it to our refineries? So the 40% that we don't produce domestically has to come from someplace else. Why not from our closest friend and ally, Canada? With a true all-of-the-above approach to energy development in this country, including projects like the Keystone XL pipeline project, I absolutely believe we can be energy independent within 5 years. The argument's been advanced that the oil sands will increase carbon emissions and that failing to build the Keystone XL pipeline will somehow reduce emissions. But let's look at the facts. Let's look at this claim more closely. Today, an ever-increasing percentage of new recovery in the oil sands is being accomplished in situ. In situ. That means with technology that makes the oil sands carbon footprint comparable to conventional drilling. In fact, the oil sands industry has reduced greenhouse gas emissions per barrel of oil produced by an average of 26% since 1990, and with some facilities achieving reductions as high as 50%. 50% reduction in carbon emissions. Today, heavy crude from the Middle East and even from California produces more carbon emissions over its life cycle than the Canadian oil sands. Also, we need to factor in that if the pipeline is not built from Alberta to the United States, a similar pipeline will be built to Canada's Pacific coast. What does that mean? Well, it means that from there, the oil will be shipped on tankers across the Pacific Ocean, a much larger and more sensitive ecosystem than the sandhills, which of course have been at issue in terms of the route of the pipeline. So it will be shipped across the ocean to be refined at facilities in China with weaker environmental standards and more emissions than our refineries right here in the United States. The United States, moreover, will continue to import its oil from the Middle East, again on tankers, so that again has to be transported across the ocean. Factor in the cost of trucking and railing the product to market over land, and the result, contrary to the claims of opponents, will be more emissions, more CO2 emissions, and a less secure distribution system without the Keystone XL pipeline than we'll have if it's built. In fact, the administration's own State Department has released 3 draft environmental impact statements finding, quote, no significant impacts, end quote, on the environment. Let me read that again. In fact, the administration's own State Department has released 3 draft environmental impact statements finding no significant impacts on the environment. So what does the administration do? They delay and ask for another environmental impact statement. What's going on? In its latest analysis in March, the State Department concluded that, quote, there would be no substantive change in global greenhouse gas emissions, end quote, associated with Keystone XL pipeline. And that raises another important point. The White House has said repeatedly that they don't want to, quote, they don't want to get ahead of the process. But the President effectively abandoned the process more than 2 years ago when he halted the project by executive action. Had he not, the State Department, in keeping with the usual process, would have issued a decision on the permit by December 2011. And that's according to a letter that was sent to me by Secretary Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State at that time, which she sent to me in August of 2011. Finally, Mr. President, I want to point out that this body, the U.S. Senate, as well as the U.S. House of Representatives, has embraced the Keystone XL project with bipartisan majorities. Congress has expressed support for the Keystone XL with 2 majority votes in the Senate and several bipartisan letters to the President. The American people have also expressed overwhelming support for the project, as I've stated. In a Harris poll released this summer, 82% of voting Americans voiced support for the Keystone XL pipeline project. I want to emphasize that and say it again. In a Harris poll released this summer, 82% of voting Americans voiced support for the Keystone XL pipeline project. According to Harris, 9 in 10 Republicans and nearly 80% of Democrats and independents believe the pipeline is in our national interest. In July, Senator Landrieu and I led a bipartisan group of our colleagues to introduce a concurrent resolution declaring the Keystone XL pipeline project in the national interest of the United States and calling on President Obama to approve it. The resolution notes that every study conducted by the State Department, including the Department's draft environmental impact statement issued in May, has found no significant impacts to the environment. Here's the text of the Senate Concurrent Resolution 21. Expressing the sense of Congress that the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline and the federal approvals required for the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline are in the national interest of the United States. In the Senate of the United States, July 31, 2013. Ms. Landrieu for herself, Mr. Hoeven, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Begich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Thune, Mr. Rich, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Johans, and Mr. Barrasso. Bipartisan group submitted the following concurrent resolution, which was referred to the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. Concurrent resolution expressing the sense of the Congress that the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline and the federal approvals required for the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline are in the national interest of the United States. Whereas safe and responsible production, transportation, and the use of oil and petroleum products provide the foundation of the energy economy of the United States, helping to secure and advance the economic prosperity, national security, and overall quality of life in the United States. Whereas the Keystone XL pipeline would provide short and long-term employment opportunities and related labor income benefits, such as government revenues associated with taxes. Whereas the state of Nebraska has thoroughly reviewed and approved the proposed Keystone XL pipeline reroute, concluding that the concerns of Nebraskans have had a major influence on the pipeline reroute and that the reroute will have minimal environmental impact. Whereas the Department of State and other federal agencies have conducted extensive studies and analysis over a long period of time on the technical, environmental, social, and economic impact of the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. Whereas assessments by the Department of State found that the Keystone XL pipeline is not likely to impact the amount of crude oil produced from the oil sands, and that approval or denial of the proposed project is unlikely to have a substantial impact on the rate of development in the oil sands. Whereas the Department of State found that the incremental life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with the Keystone XL project are estimated in the range of 0.07 to 0.83 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, with the upper end of this range representing 12 one-thousandths of 1% of the total metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted in the United States in 2011. Whereas after extensive evaluation of potential impact to land and water resources along the 875-mile proposed route of the Keystone XL pipeline, the Department of State found the analysis of potential impacts associated with the construction and normal operation of the proposed project suggests there would be no significant impacts to most resources along the proposed project route, parenthesis, assuming Keystone complies with all laws and required conditions and measures, close parenthesis. Whereas the Department of State found that spills associated with the proposed project that entered the environment are expected to be rare and relatively small, and that there is no evidence of increased corrosion or other pipeline threat due to viscosity of diluted bitumen oil that will be transported by the Keystone XL pipeline. Whereas the National Research Council convened a special expert panel to review the risk of transporting diluted bitumen by pipeline and issued a report in June 2013 to the Department of Transportation, in which the National Research Council found that existing literature indicates that transportation of diluted bitumen poses no increased risk of pipeline failure. Whereas plans to incorporate 57 project-specific special conditions relating to the design, construction, and operations of the Keystone XL pipeline led the Department of State to find that the pipeline will have a degree of safety over any other typically constructed domestic oil pipeline. And whereas the Department of State found that oil destined to be shipped through the pipeline from the oil sand region of Canada and oil shale deposits in the United States would otherwise move by modes of transportation if the Keystone XL pipeline is not built. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Senate, the House of Representatives concurring, that it is the sense of Congress that, one, the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline will promote sound investment in the infrastructure of the United States. Two, construction of the Keystone XL pipeline will promote energy security in North America and will generate an increase in private sector jobs that will benefit both the regions surrounding the Keystone XL pipeline and the United States as a whole. And three, completion of the Keystone XL pipeline is in the national interest of the United States. Mr. President, I have worked toward approval of the Keystone XL pipeline, first as a governor and now as a U.S. Senator, because I believe it is just the kind of project that will grow our economy and create the jobs our country so desperately needs. And it will do so with good environmental stewardship. At the same time, it will reduce our dependence on the Middle East for oil, which is what the American people have sought for decades. Mr. President, the Keystone XL pipeline project is long, long overdue. For the benefit of our economy, our environment, and our long-term energy security, this project needs to be approved, and it needs to be approved without delay. As I said, we can do these things. We can do these things and so much more, but it takes a bipartisan effort. It takes bipartisanship. And we've got to find a way to tackle these tough issues for the benefit of the American people, and we've got to do it in the way that has always been the hallmark of this institution, of the United States Senate, and that's on a bipartisan basis. Earlier today, I read accounts that I've received from my state of citizens who've been impacted adversely by Obamacare. Obamacare is an example of what I'm talking about, an example of something that was passed on a partisan basis rather than on a bipartisan basis. So when we look across this great country, it's very understandable why the public support is not there. This was a policy passed solely with votes from one side of the aisle, in the House and the Senate. We need to pass things in a bipartisan way. We need policies for this country, particularly on these big issues, that can garner bipartisan support if we expect the American people to truly support the policies as well. I'd like to read several more accounts, true stories, that we've received from people from our state and my office about the impact that Obamacare is having on their lives. First one comes from Crystal, North Dakota. It's a frustrated senior not eligible for Medicare, seeking ways to cut back to afford Obamacare. This individual writes, "Just who is this health care reform law helping? My insurance broker, American Family, is no longer carrying medical insurance, so they lose. The average American that goes out and earns a paycheck, he loses. Doctors don't like it. So how many new doctors will there be? I just got off the phone with the insurance brokerage company that has taken over my former broker's customers. I learned that if I sign up before the end of the year, I can save by not having maternity coverage. What a laugh. But after 2014, I have to have maternity coverage. Can you see all of us senior citizens walking around pregnant? So with the cheapest coverage, I will be paying $473 more per month than my current coverage, and my premium will be $1,288 per month. That's a 37% increase per month. Next year, the rate will increase to cover maternity. And if you have children under 18, you have to have dental and maybe vision, too. I already try to conserve on our monthly expenses, have heat set to 55 degrees, and when gusts are here, I set it to 65 degrees. I turn lights off, don't smoke, don't drink, even quit drinking pop. I don't eat out, don't even go out to drive to get the mail every day, and don't buy new clothes. I don't go to visit family like I used to. What should I cut out of our monthly expenses? Take weekly showers? Get the mail once a week? Eat once a day, hibernate, get a third job? Cut out the grandkids' events? So, quote, affordable care, end quote. I wonder how many heart attacks there will be after Americans open up their health insurance bills in 2014 and even more in 2015, because it will be a shocker. Here's another story from an independent North Dakotan in Minnewacan who suggests seceding from the union over Obamacare. Quote, I would like you to know what the health care reform law is doing for my family. The insurance company we've had since 1994 is no longer going to offer health insurance starting April of 2014. When I called to get quotes to replace my current health insurance policy, I learned I would have to pay $200 more for a plan with a deductible that is twice the amount that I currently have. Then when I eventually have to go on an Obamacare policy, I will have to pay for maternity, which I haven't had for 17 years and have not needed. Plus, I will have to pay for children's dental and vision, which my family won't be able to use because my children are 18 and 20 years old. The health reform insurance policy will cost me twice as much as I am paying now. So please tell me how this is going to help me. The only thing this is doing is giving another freebie to those who choose not to work. This is very frustrating, and I'm starting to believe that seceding from the Union and making our country much better for the residents of North Dakota. We certainly have enough of our own resources to take care of ourselves. I hope you're trying to change the health care reform bill. Here's one from a hardware store owner who's unable to grow his business due to Obamacare. Quote, I just received my renewal from Blue Cross Blue Shield for my 5 employees, and the premium for the same coverage went up from $2,179.50 a month to $3,090.40 per month. I'm a small-town hardware store owner. Where is this money to come from? I'm so frustrated by the lack of understanding that our country's government officials have regarding the policies they create. It appears that we all need to go on welfare to survive. Most people who work and generate the money are feeling helpless. I don't think you have a clue as to the frustration that is out here. I was looking to expand and grow my business, but with the drain that I believe Obamacare will have on the already strained economy will be much greater than the Great Depression. So as a small business owner, why should I invest in the future? So our U.S. government can continue its business as usual? I think not. Mr. President, I present these stories and others that I have presented earlier in the day, along with my colleagues, because they're real stories from real Americans across the country that are suffering because of Obamacare. We have put forward the kind of market-based solutions to replace Obamacare that empower people, empower them to choose their own health care insurance and their own health care provider. And we need to go to work to provide the right kind of health care reform. We need to do that on a bipartisan basis. And I think that by presenting these stories, it's not just a case of members of the Senate or members of Congress saying, hey, this is what I think is happening. These are real stories. These are people telling us what's happening to them in their lives. And we need to take heed, and we need to address the very real and the very valid concerns that they are raising. And we can do it. We absolutely can do it. And I come back to where I started my comments after our last vote. We're here today voting on nominations. Due to the change in the Senate rules by the majority party, advise and consent no longer requires participation or any votes whatsoever from the minority party. That creates a situation now where judges, other nominees can be approved solely by one party. We've seen what happens when one party and one party alone can confirm appointees or can pass laws like Obamacare. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for our country, and that's why the Senate was set up to require bipartisanship, to require consensus, so that as we pass the important policies and laws that will help lift our country and move it forward, that we have the broad base of support from both sides of the aisles across this great nation. And that's what's required to make things work. And that is why it's incumbent on all of us in this institution to reach out and find ways to make sure that we have that bipartisanship, and so that we create the kind of policies that will truly move our country forward. That's what the American people have sent us here to do. Mr. President, I see that my esteemed colleague from the great state of Utah is on the Senate floor, and at this time, I would yield to him.
Thank you. Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I've certainly enjoyed the remarks of the distinguished senator from North Dakota. He's done a terrific job here in the Senate. He's made a real